Thank you all very much, and thanks especially to Chancellor Berdahl, my fellow South Dakotan. But I have to put this in context at the outset. He was from the city. He was from Sioux Falls. It was the first town that I ever visited in which they showed movies in the middle of the week in the afternoon. And it was so large that you had to have the address of the home that you were going to go to a party. In all the towns I'd ever lived in up to that point, you just knew where people lived. But Chancellor Berdahl came from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and I am still in awe of that great metropolitan area wherever I go. Let me just say one other thing about my daughter Andrea, who graduated from Berkeley, and it is still a matter of great familial pride, obviously, that she did that. Many people who were here at the time may not have known her by her name because she was on Cal-X as Cindy Lou Who, which is how she was widely known in Berkeley, and in our family we still think of her as Cindy Lou Who. And I think it might have been an appropriate cover in some of her courses as well. So we're very happy that she was able to come back. And the line that I've used before is that we had a daughter at Berkeley and at Stanford simultaneously, which could cause some strain in some families. But as I said when I came here to Berkeley when Andrea was a freshman, I said it was like having one who was a member of the Grateful Dead and the other one who was a member of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. It always goes over well at Berkeley. It does not go over so well at Stanford. Thank you all very much.
Well, Tom, this might present a good place for us to begin. As we were walking over here, you were telling me about the years that you spent actually reporting here. It's some very tumultuous years at Berkeley. And you were here how long?
Well, I have these vivid memories. I remember coming here in 1966, almost instantly after I signed on at NBC. I had a kind of divided assignment. I worked for KNBC and also for the network, and I covered a lot of the free speech movement, the anti-war demonstrations that were going on in this campus, and the Ronald Reagan campaign at the same time. A lot of people don't now have an appreciation of what a tumultuous time that was in California and about the place of the university, which was in some peril, I believe, at that time. And in 1967, early on, after he had been inaugurated, there was the first meeting of the regents on this campus. And Clark Kerr, who was the president of the university-wide system, decided that he had to have, in effect, a showdown with the new governor of the state of California, and he lost that showdown. And it was the beginning of a new era, I think, for the university and also for California politics. And what I remember vividly about that was, in those days, we didn't have the technology that we have now, and I was going to dash back to Los Angeles to get this on the air, and it was a kind of a ferocious winter storm, and I was racing in the freeway going to the Oakland airport. I'd sent my camera crew on ahead with half the film, and I had half, hoping that in a kind of fail-safe fashion, some of it would get back to Los Angeles. And I was forced off the road by a semi, and I was standing out there knee-deep in mud with an NBC shipping bag, drenched to the skin, trying to wave down a car, and a woman pulled over and said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I've got to go to the Oakland airport. I'll give you $20 if you'll get me there." And she said, "Well, jump in." And we started driving madly to the Oakland airport, and we pulled up in front, and it was clear that I was going to make it to the airplane. So I said, "Listen, here's your $20. And she said, "I don't need your $20. And I said, "No, please take the $20. She said, "Well, that just doesn't seem fair to me. I tell you what, I own a liquor store." And she reached in the back and gave me 2 bottles of Jack Daniels. It was not a great night for the university. It was a very good night for a 26-year-old reporter, I got to tell you that right now.
Did you enjoy yourself during those years? I mean, what do you think? You were married?
I was married, and Meredith and I had left South Dakota in 1962 with everything that we owned and $700 in debt in the back of a Chevy 2, and within, at that point, it was less than 4 years later, we were living in Los Angeles, and we were both a little overwhelmed by the idea that we had come all that distance in such a short time. I had gone to work first in Omaha and then in Atlanta, and that's when NBC found me and brought me to Los Angeles, and there were 2 vivid memories, one immediate and one came a little later. When Meredith got to Los Angeles, we went out on Saturday night to a restaurant and down at the beach, and you must remember we both lived in a small town out on the prairie, and after dinner Meredith walked down to the surf and waded in and stood there in the moonlight, and I looked at her and I thought, our lives will never be the same again. And I have always felt that California kind of has that promise for America. I think that people have come here, and they continue to come here, not just from these shores, obviously, but from Asia as well. And it is the land where your lives are changed, and almost always for the better. The other experience that I had, obviously, is that I Omaha, Atlanta, Los Angeles, and Washington, went to New York, and was named the host of the Today program, and feeling an exaggerated sense of my own importance, I'm sure, at that time. It had been my mother's favorite program. David Garroway had been the originator of it all, and I was in a department store in New York wandering around, and I was aware of this man beginning to follow me, and if you have these kinds of public jobs, you can kind of read their expressions, and I could just see this man thinking, I wonder if that's Tom Brokaw. So I, in my new sense of 33-year-old self-importance, said to him, looked at him actually, didn't even say it aloud, just kind of nodded as if to say, yes. I'm Tom Brokaw. And, well, it only encouraged him, and he came running up to me, and he said, you're Tom Brokaw, right? And I said, yes, that's right, I am. And he said, I'm from Omaha. You used to work in Omaha. And I said, yes, that's right, I did. And he looked at me for a long moment, and he said, whatever happened to you anyway?
Well, you know, that raises an interesting question. I mean, you spent most of your life interviewing other people, and yet it seems to me that in this day and age, people in the media reach a point where suddenly they vault over a certain dividing line, and suddenly they're being interviewed.
Right.
And now this has something to do, I think, with being elevated to this sort of status of celestial stardom. How do you feel about being the subject of the interviews that you once were conducting yourself?
Well, one of the things that I've learned as an interviewer, and I've applied this as an interviewee, is that I pick the parts of the question that I want to answer.
That's not good news for me.
And that can be very helpful, actually. In a very early stage of my life, I learned the real value of this business about being known in a public way, because I was working when I was finishing up my undergraduate years at the University of South Dakota. I was commuting to Sioux City, Iowa, where I worked in the newsroom at the television station there. And I was paid a pittance, and I was trying as well to pay for my college and trying to save a little money so we could be married at the end of that summer. And on a Sunday, this is a true story, I was down in downtown Sioux City, Iowa. That was my television universe in those days. I was, I suppose, even the kind of semi-acne 20-year-old, a big deal to the people who saw me on television. And I was standing outside this restaurant trying to figure out what on the menu I could go in and afford for a Sunday meal and still have enough to get to college the next day. When out came two very well-dressed couples who had obviously not had to worry about the right side of the menu at all. They'd been in having a sumptuous Sunday meal, and they looked very prosperous, and they were flourishing. And the two women got very excited seeing me on the streets of Sioux City, Iowa, because they'd seen me on television, and they came running up and they said, oh, we watch you all the time, we think you're just wonderful, isn't this exciting, you've made our whole day. And I thought, what they don't understand is that I can't afford to go into the same restaurant that they've just come out of and buy a real meal. And it was it's lasted with me forever. It kind of put into perspective, if you will, the real value of public recognition. It means a lot more to the other people than it does to me in most instances.
And yet, Tom, I think it would be fair to say that this kind of public recognition, I mean, it is a grace of sorts, but it also is an enormous kind of a burden. It I think, makes people wear masks, adopt a kind of a curious defensive strategy.
I am very careful in an almost conditioned reflex way. It's not that I'm going to misbehave in public, but in small ways and large, it does alter your behavior to some degree. I overtip in New York in taxi cabs. I do, because it's just easier than reading on page 6 that you're one of the 5 cheapest tippers in New York City. You know, it's easier to give them a couple of extra bucks than to have to read that. I try not to go through life looking over my shoulder, seeing if anybody recognizes me. By and large, people are, I find, very pleasant. You know, I'm on airplanes a lot, and it's less true in New York because New York is a pretty brusque town, and they're not going to get much excited about somebody that they see on television regularly. If you're a big sports star, that's a different proposition, or a rock star. But by and large, I can get through life there. if you go outside of New York, it becomes a different equation, and especially on airplanes. But people, by and large, are very nice and respectful of your privacy and have interesting questions, and you often learn from them. The other part of my life is that now at this age, and having done it as long as I have, I do, and I suppose I may be kidding myself a little bit, but I do think that I've learned something along the way, and so I feel more freedom now to say, either on the air or on occasions like this, some of what I think about the world or about news events or whatever. Most recently, I did it when Chelsea Clinton went off to college on that Friday, and as a parent, I watched that scene, and I was very touched by it. And so I said on the air at the end of the broadcast that any parent who sent a child out of the nest off to campus knows that there will be broken hearts that you'll never hear about, and missed classes and failed grades and 36-hour road trips to nowhere and back. And if, as parents, we don't know that about our own children, it seems to me that Chelsea Clinton is entitled to her secrecy, whether she has Secret Service agents or not. And I just thought it was something I wanted to say at the end of the broadcast. And what was so touching is that I got this wonderful call from the president on Saturday night, and he was in a very kind of reflective and very mellow mood, and he said how grateful they were in their family because it was exactly what they were thinking as well. And I assured him that even though she was at Stanford, not at Berkeley, these were going to be glorious 4 years, and I hope that he'll be able, and that Mrs. Clinton will be able to enjoy these years, even though they bring to the campus a real aura about it. So I do think that there are times when we have to, as public people, kind of acknowledge that there are times when they should be able to enjoy, and other public people should be able to enjoy, the ordinary rituals of life.
Do you think it's more difficult for you to cover people such as the president or CEOs of corporations, leaders, heads of state, after you've gotten to know them than before?
I do. I think it is a problem. And they also think, even though I may not have a real personal relationship with a CEO or somebody who's powerful in politics, one of my children, I think it's Andrea, who believes that any time a celebrity sees another celebrity in a restaurant, they have to go over and say hello to each other, whether they know each other or not. And I think that that's probably true. And it certainly is true if you're a reporter and you go in and you're going to a CEO's office and it's something that's an important social issue, and the first thing that he says, because most of them still are male, how's my old friend Jack Welch, your boss, the head of GE?
That can be chilling.
Kind of putting you on notice right off the bat, you know, and didn't I see you last year at some event somewhere and then trying to cause a connection. And therefore, when there are those occasions when I think it would be better to send in one of our other reporters who may not have that relationship, that's the decision that I'll generally make. At the same time, you know, to be perfectly immodest about this, and it's true not just for me but for all of my colleagues as well, we are at a place in life where we can pick up the phone and almost always get who we want to on the other end of it. And if they turn down the various layers of NBC at the bottom for interview requests and keep working up, you know, the last call comes from me, and it generally is helpful, or at least we get a real explanation about why they don't want to do it.
Well, when you're interviewing these people, do you ever hear a little voice in your head saying, well, that's an interesting question, but it might ruin the atmosphere?
No, I don't think I've ever succumbed that much. I often say to people when I'm going in, I'm going to say, listen, I've got, you know, this is going to work best if you have some direct responses to my very direct questions, because we're not here to waste each other's time. And you know, you can frame those questions in a way that you're going to elicit what it is that you want to have. And I, frankly, am not all that close to the newsmakers. I try to keep some distance between them, and they know what my job is when I show up there. You know, they're not naive about it.
I wonder, though, I mean, it seems to be a curious class that Marx never quite defined, that has nothing to do with rich or poor. As you suggest, it is the class of well-known people who feel that they know each other because they've seen each other. And I wonder if that doesn't have some sort of a chilling effect on the ability of the press, once it becomes part of this class, to actually play the watchdog function to do what has to be done, which sometimes isn't.
Yeah, but I think, with all due respect, Orville, I think that has less to do with the people who are well-known or who are operating the upper tiers of whatever food chain or however you want to describe it. I think the greater danger, frankly, and I've talked about this openly with my friends. I still some of my very closest friends are in the Washington Press Corps. That has become so incestuous because what has happened is that print reporters, especially, have learned that their lecture fees go up and they get more access to their sources and so on if they appear on the television talk shows, and then it's only a natural evolution of that. There's this kind of hubristic exercise that happens now on Saturdays and Sundays with the reporters who are on there. They're not interviewing newsmakers anymore. They're interviewing each other, and they're telling us what they think instead of telling us what they have learned, what somebody who may be a committee chairman or an undersecretary of defense or somebody who may be in one of the NGOs or one of the other active government agencies, what they believe. And there's a real coziness down there. And you hear it all the time. Somebody will be saying, well, Senator Lieberman, now he's a good friend of mine, and I like him a lot. But I got to tell you, I think he's a little wrong. I think that's the wrong kind of conditioning. When I was in Washington, and these were not just the good old days, there were 2 or 3 kind of gatekeepers for the press around. One of them was a man by the name of Peter Lissagore. Some of you who are older may remember him. He worked for the Chicago Daily News. He was the quintessential newspaper man. He was a wisecracking, great writer, very snappy guy, had a lot of different lines about everything that was going on, and he always kept distance from himself and the people that he knew, and they all loved him. The politicians loved him for who he was.
Did they give him interviews?
Pardon me?
Did they give him interviews? I guess.
Yeah, and they wanted to be around Peter just because they enjoyed his company. And he was very good with those of us who were coming up through the ranks. He would silently mouth an expletive to me if he saw me beginning to soar at a convention. I'd look down into the press rows from my eagle's nest up there through the glass, and I would always spot Peter sitting in the press row, and then he would mouth something to me. And I would get it instantly, and it was very helpful. There's very little of that left anymore because everybody's eager. I think it's a condition of society. Everybody's eager for the spotlight now. Reporters, print and electronic, and politicians and business people and cultural figures and so on, and they all want to think that they don't count in this crowded universe unless people know who they are and they've got kind of this reputation and they move easily through these various layers.
Do you think as you head into the end of your 50s that you've had a diminishment of ego in terms of your, I think younger people sort of operate in a scarcity environment. And if so, well, first I guess answer the question, then I have a follow-up.
Yeah, no, I think that my ego, I think the fires of my ego have been banked. And that's self-examination on my part. You may get protest here before the end of the evening, but and I think it's in part because as everyone knows who's going through these various levels of life, is that when you get to the 50s, you're confident about what you know and what you've been through. But it's at this stage in life you realize the vast universe of what you don't know and what you got wrong earlier in your life, or the assumptions that you made in your 30s and 40s that simply have not come true at all in your 50s. And that's a humbling experience, and I think it's very useful. I'm, again, to be modest, I spent a lot of my career at NBC as a kind of boy wonder poster child for the network. I got a lot of big assignments at an early stage, and that became kind of my condition of my thinking, and I got away with a lot just by being brash and so on. And now I'm the oldest person in most of the rooms at NBC, and I look around and I think the penalty for these young people coming up now through the ranks is that they don't get to do what I got to do. I was given room to go off and cover stories. Now there's such a terrific demand for performance that people get dropped into studios instantly. They become overnight television stars, either at the network level or at the San Francisco level, and they never get that far from a microphone and from a desk. And they're good people. They're bright, and they've got their ego in check, but there are lots of forces at work on them that will, in some way, make it difficult for them to, I think, develop a whole experience.
I mean, maybe in some sense that's one of the reasons why people have become so distrustful of the press. I mean, it's a rather shocking statistic to know that 2/3 of Americans don't trust the press. What's happened?
Well, I think it's probably always been true. I think they're thinking about it a lot more because they're bombarded. This universe of journalism has expanded so greatly in the last 10 years, and it's not just in the electronic journalism. You go into any magazine store now, and you see all those choices that you have. Men's Health, 45 different titles. Women's Health, 29 different titles. 9 tabloid, 8 or 9 outdoor magazines now, biker magazines, anything that you want to see. So there's a lot of it going on out there, and they all seem to be shouting at the audience, at the readers, at the viewers. And I think that people then begin to back up a little bit. And then what happens on television is that everybody looks so glossy, and they know that we're well paid. And I once had a friend say something that was very useful to me. It was in the middle of Watergate. He lived out in Iowa, and I'd known him a long time, quite a conservative man politically, so he was still at that stage sympathetic to Richard Nixon. And I called him, and I would kind of check in with him from time to time to see what he thought. And he said, listen, you stand there in those expensive suits and the great-looking ties that you've got and that shirt. He said, and you talking to that camera, and he said, why should I trust you? And I said, you've known me a long time. He said, but even though I've known you a long time, you seem like a distant person to me. And I think that therefore you do have to, as a reporter, find ways that you can show people that, show them both humility and be willing to confess your mistakes along the way, and to demonstrate to them that you identify with their lives, so that they know that you're not just reporting, but you're empathetic to their point of view.
But surely something really radical has happened. I mean, everybody one talks to, and I think this is true of people that we know in the media. I know very few people, and you may be actually an exception, who can say, this is really good. I feel dignified. I feel like I'm doing what I ought to do. I mean, I hear more and more colleagues saying, there's something wrong.
I do think that I do think that a lot of us feel that there's something wrong, and I think that what we have to do is stand back, and there is a lot more. Let me just also say at the outset that there's a lot more self-examination going on within the press now, print and electronic, than there has been traditionally. When I began 35 years ago doing this kind of work, there was more the journalistic magazine, and that was about it. And it was kind of an elitist magazine that would, in the Columbia Journalism Review. But now almost every newspaper has somebody who is reviewing the work of the press in some fashion, both print and electronic. And my own impression is that the community of journalism is unhappy because it may not be unhappy with its individual work, the component parts of what is going on, but because there are so many low common denominators at work, and everyone feels that they're being tarred by that brush a little bit.
But don't you think many people also feel that they have to pick up that brush themselves more often than they'd like to?
Well, I do think that it's a more vigorous time, but I always invite people to go back and look at the newspapers in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s in this country. Look at the newspapers in San Francisco, and the kind of life that. Listen, there was no greater newspaper man, in my experience, than the man that we honor here tonight, Herb Caen. He was a great friend. He was one of those people, even though I didn't know him when I set out to get into this business, that I thought that this would be a great way to make a living because you would know people like Herb Caen. And Herb Caen had a great newspaperman's rogue's eye in that column about things. He commanded your attention. He knew how to make people laugh, but also how to make them uncomfortable for the best possible reasons. And he knew when to put in things in there that people would kind of say, God, I wouldn't say that, but did you see what Herb Caen said today? So it's been a part of the rich tradition of American journalism for a long time. I think there's just so much of it now. I think that people just feel bombarded by it. The Diana death and funeral was the perfect, most recent example of that. It was inescapable. That universe is so big and so rich, so dense now that you can't wade through it. And I happen to believe that it's part of the reason that she reached very quickly the icon status that she did. I think there were a lot of people who were stunned by her death, who were supportive of her and admired her and were genuinely moved by the loss of her. But I think after day 3, that population of Diana mourners had increased by a magnitude of what? I don't know, 3 or 4 times, in part because wherever people clicked with a remote control or turned on a radio or turned on a news magazine show or read a newspaper, they were inundated with news about Diana, and they were told, in effect, that they should care deeply about it.
But of course, if the surveys are to be believed, and everybody these days is hooked up to a market survey, it's what we wanted. And I'm wondering if this process where we go out and try to identify what people want and then give it to them, it isn't in some sense distorting.
It's dangerous.
Yeah.
It is dangerous.
Well, talk about it.
Well, at the end of that week, I tried to get at this. We found 5 people who, editorial page director from the Atlanta Constitution, Roger Rosenblatt, Ben Bradley, can't remember who all the players were. I was running back and forth to London so fast that week to talk about the phenomenon of what happened. Christopher Hitchens was in on that as well, and I thought that he said, listen, I have many of you probably know who Christopher Hitchens is. He's
coming out next week, actually.
Yeah, British writer, and he's got a very sharp point of view. And he said, I don't dispute that she was a very popular figure. He said, my problem with the coverage was that there was no examination of her life or of the many questions that were there. And we, in fact, did get at it on a number of occasions, but it's almost blown away by the force of the other coverage. The people don't see that. They really just do see these long, mournful pieces of people queuing up at Buckingham Palace or St. James's or Kensington or in the streets. And I dare say on that Saturday morning, it was one of the most remarkable sights of my life. I don't think I'll ever see anything again quite like that. And I think 50 years from now, people will be trying to grapple with why that happened at this time in our lives. What was it about this woman and that family that caused this enormous outpouring of grief? And I do think that there will be a conclusion that she lived her life in this kind of superheated electronic fishbowl, and so everyone felt that they knew her, and they came to identify with her struggles and her frailties, and she had the advantage, obviously, as she carved out her own place in life, of having this dysfunctional family, the Windsors, on the other side, because there was no one who could work up much sympathy for them. I mean, I'm trying to be a reporter here. I mean, the fact is that even in London today, and those of you who've been going to that country for a long time, you could go into the East End of the worst poverty-stricken neighborhoods, and people would stand up for the Queen because they identified with her and it gave meaning to their own lives. That is not true anymore. There has been a real decline in the feeling for the royal family. So I think a combination of all those things, and then this great wholesome beauty that she had, and people felt they'd grown up with her. So I think it was genuine, but there was too little examination of many of the open questions.
Well, it's clearly what we want. I mean, it's the old question. It may be what we want, but is it what we need?
Well, I think news, in fairness, though, Orville, has always been a mix of want and need and importance and just sheer interesting and sometimes pure entertainment. And it's tweaking that mix so that you don't let one kind of overwhelm the other. There's been a real examination of the nightly news broadcasts on the networks about whether they've gone, quote, soft, or whether they're doing too many features and that kind of thing. And what I say to people is that we still cover the day's important news in the first 2 segments, and then we're trying then to do more analytical stories about larger issues, but we're also going into new news. There is a real appetite out there, and it is something that people do need to know about developments, as an easy example, in women's health. That was a story that simply wasn't covered. When I first came into the business, journalism in America was a white male, middle-aged view of the world. And anything that happened kind of outside a gavel falling in a committee hearing room in Washington or outside the interest of that particular editor's point of view, mostly reflected in the white male middle age, wasn't counted as news. What we missed in the evolution of America, technologically, politically, culturally, and so on, I mean, there's a long list of things. Healthcare in the country changed, and we didn't catch up to it. the place of women changed and get covered only in the extremes. You only heard from Germaine Greer, or you only heard from Gloria Steinem, or maybe Betty Friedan, when in households all across America the relationship was changing with men and women, and the workplace was changing, and the academy was changing. I don't think we did a very good job on that, and yet some people would say, well, that's soft news. It's not.
What would you say to parents who won't have a television in their house because they think it has a deleterious effect on their kids?
I'm sympathetic to that point of view. We had no television sets in our daughters' bedrooms when they were growing up, which is in New York. I got to tell you, where they lived was like they were in utter denial, like they were being cared for by Mother Teresa. No television set in your room, no telephone. My God, you know.
Dad.
You have abusive parents. But I think, like all instruments of communication, that if it's used in a prudent fashion, it's a marvelous tool to know what's going on in the world. And it does have an off button as well as an on button. And I think the big danger is that, you know, most parents are just not there in a kind of watchdog role, or however you want to, gatekeeper role, about what it is that they're watching and how much they are watching. I have a friend who works at NBC, and he has a 10 or 11-year-old son, maybe 12. He did not let him go see Air Force One. And I said, Bill, how the hell did you get away with that? I mean, every kid at that age wants to see Air Force One. And he said, yep. And I thought it was too violent for him. And he said, it's been a long, difficult struggle this fall, but he's not going to see Air Force One. And I thought it was so commendable. I was thinking about it just today. I don't know how many other parents in America could have gotten away with it. And here's a man who works, he's our number 2 executive at NBC News. He lives in the flow of things, but he just decided that that was not something that he wanted his son to do. So I do think that parents can't just say, well, we're going to remove the instrument because they'll find a way of finding it. I think that they have to talk to them about it in intelligent ways, about how you use the instrument, what's important on it, and how it can be used to you, and set real rules.
You have a fairly optimistic view. Yet I can remember times when you had a more pessimistic view. Has something changed?
I've gotten older. We were talking about that. And as I've gotten older, I've forgotten why I was pessimistic.
Well, also, I
tell you what has changed.
And pessimism isn't in fashion right now.
What is?
Pessimism isn't in fashion.
No, it isn't in fashion. I am not Pollyannish. I think that there are real problems that we have to deal with. And I do believe that we are in an era of distraction. Things are good for most people in this country. There's a real thriving, throbbing economic prosperity going on out there for a lot of Americans right now. There are still too many people at the bottom, and there's too much of a gap between the top and the bottom. The cyber technology has opened up a whole new world that people are excited about, and we're inventing it here on a daily basis, and people are feeling good about that. Youngsters that I know, and I use the word loosely, young people in their 20s and 30s seem to adapt to the idea of their future reality in a way that I don't think that I could have, because they expect to have 4 and 5 or 6 different jobs by the time they're in their mid-30s, and they are happily moving between these various jobs until they find the right fit, and they're making decisions that work for their lives. I do a fair amount of commencement speaking, and I've been going around the campuses the last couple of years asking faculty and students what's on their mind. And more of both students and faculty and administrators are saying to me, personal relationships are very important, and that's what they're worrying about, and that's what they're in pursuit of right now. Whereas I was felt like I had to get on that fast track to conventional success and stay on it. So I do think that we have an ever brighter population. More people are going to college. I think that we are beginning to struggle a little more effectively with some of the persistent and most vexing social problems that we have, not yet successfully, as I'd like them to be, but people are beginning to engage them. race primary among them. That's when I said earlier that I had, I think, expectations when I was younger that have not been fulfilled. I think that the resolution of racism in America was one of them when I was in my 20s. I thought we're going to pass the Civil Rights Bill, goodwill about doing something about race. We're going to get on with this issue, and we haven't in a way that we need to. But at the same time, across the country, as you go into communities, you find an ever larger black professional class and middle class. You do find some instances, not enough by any means. I did a whole documentary on this last year, of communities and neighborhoods and families trying to find a way to live together that we didn't have in the past. That there, you know, I grew up in apartheid America. There was a real division. So I am more optimistic because I think people are using information now pretty effectively for their own purposes. I do think that we feel that we're caught in this kind of typhoon of mindlessness, but you can seek shelter in a typhoon as well.
Well, might we also be caught in a typhoon of too much information? I mean, I often myself just feel numb by it, and knowing your schedule. I mean, it seems almost unthinkable that you'd want to absorb one more bite. I mean, does this surfeit of information...
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, it's the cliche of taking a drink from a fire hydrant on a daily basis. But I think part of it is that a lot of this is the new technology. It's a phenomenon to us, and we're trying to find our way through it yet. And I am confident that we will. I mean, I think that people I described 3 years ago. A lot of what goes on the internet is the cyberspace equivalent of teenage joyrides, kind of pointless and mindless. You know, just kind of cruising around out there in cyberspace, kind of not knowing where you're going or why you're going there. But that was also true in the early days of television. You know, when television came on, there were a lot of sunken cheekbones and hollow eyes, and people just staring at that screen for hours.
Still are.
Still are. Still staring at that screen for hours at a time. So I think that people will. I have faith in their ability to kind of sort it all out. When we talked, when I was more pessimistic a few years ago, I thought that the country kind of lost its way. But I must say I'm very heartened when I go around America now and go into communities and find groups that grow up kind of organically to address real issues in their community. There has been, for example, in the last couple of years in America, especially at the local level, a much clearer understanding and a greater sense of urgency about public education. We've got, and in Seattle and Chicago and even in New York now and in other cities, people really are beginning to pay attention to what it is that we have to do, beginning with the simple premise that by the time you're in the third grade, you should be able to read. Now, that seems like a kind of fundamental place to start, but it's a starting place.
Well, does this presuppose, then, that maybe now, in your view, the system more or less works, whereas when you were in Berkeley, and I was here at that same time, I mean, it seemed pretty obvious to us, maybe we were wrong, but that the system sort of didn't work.
Well, I think it worked. I think it. You know, this is a complex society, and we tend to judge it by what's going on in front of us. In 1968, I went from the streets of Chicago back to my hometown in South Dakota, thinking that anarchy would reign, that what happened in Chicago was happening everywhere in America. And I got back to Yankton, and the community was intact, and people had their values in place, and they had a more measured view, really, of how we were going to work our way out of it. And I got in a terrible argument with a lot of my friends, and also with my parents, because I thought that they would see the world the same way that I did. Now, at this age, when I reflect on it, my parents had survived the Depression. They'd come through World War II.
Tell us what your father and mother did.
Well, they grew up in the Great Plains of South Dakota in the worst possible time. I've been doing some research on this, and it was the equivalent of Siberia. in America. The crops simply blew away. Hordes of grasshoppers came in. There was no rain. They had no soil conservation practices. My grandfather was an Irishman who'd gone off to college, sent there by his father, was a big Irishman who bought a section of land for his sons. They'd all gone off to college. My grandfather, unfortunately, was the only one who came back and thought he could make a living at this. And by 1932, he was feeding the corn to the hogs rather than trying to sell it because he wouldn't make any money. He had a mortgage. He lost everything. They moved to town. My mother was 16, very bright, and wanted desperately to go to college. The college cost $250 a year, and there was no way that she could go to college. And she was dating my father at the time, who dropped out of school at age 9, probably, maybe even 8. And he had a kind of secret dream of his own idea of working class success. And he had gotten a job in a construction company and discovered that he had these inherent skills to operate big machinery. And so he was working very, very hard, racing all over the Midwest, building highways and things like that. And they got married at the height of the Depression. And I've asked my mother, I said, what were your dreams? What did you think? She said, dreams, we didn't, day to day. Those were our dreams. All around them was abject poverty. People with no hope, losing everything, banks closing, farms being blown out from under people, terrible suicides that no one knew about, no help wherever you went. They just found their way. No Social Security, no medical underpinning. Then along comes the war, and everybody's asked to go off to the war and save the world. And they did, and they came home and they started building the country. And they built these institutions and great highways and gave us great art and great medicine and all those other things. They never whined, never asked for anything. So when the 60s hit, we were all, in the streets wondering where in the hell the world was going. They'd been through a lot by then. And if you went beyond the crowds and you went into Middle America, you did find great broad veins of people who thought that Vietnam was a terrible mistake, but that they believed that we would emerge from it. But they knew that they had to get on with their lives, and that the system kind of held together. I think, in many ways, that Watergate was every bit as great a constitutional crisis as Vietnam was.
In terms of shattering confidence.
Belief. I mean, this country depends on a law-abiding president of the United States, who has a respect for judicial restraint and for holding the country together. And here was this man in the bunker, lying to the country day after day after day after day to retain power, and dividing the country deeply and bitterly during that time, and withholding information from Congress, and not just partisans on the Hill, members of his own party, and not telling the truth to his own family or his closest advisors, and letting them go off to jail. Think about that, what we went through.
Well, do you think that kind of skews the way our generation as journalists looked at the world, to be suspicious, things didn't work?
Yes, I do. I think it's had an impact on it. I think Vietnam and Watergate all had an impact on that, and I do think that some of what makes people uncomfortable now, for example, in terms of how public figures' lives are covered, grows out of that. Because I used to say, people would say, the press has too much power. I said, listen, we don't know a fraction of what's going on back there. We have too little power. You may not like us to be your advocates, but that's what we are. We're there to try to find out what's going on in your name, and we can't find out. You can't, if you work in the inner sanctum of the White House, you can't find out what's going on in the next office. And you think we have too much power? And you review any day what goes on in a congressional office, in a government agency or whatever, press knows very little about it. And therefore the public knows very little about it.
But does the public want to know? I mean, that's the more crucial question. Do we care anymore?
I think it sometimes takes longer. I think we get impatient. I think that they get it in the end always. That's what I always believe. I don't think the American people over the long curve are seldom fooled. I think that they kind of get it. And I think that they get it on their own time, and they again have the long memory of their own lives or the history of this country, and for the most part, they kind of look at it and say, well, this is what's in my interest and the interest of my family, and we'll go on from here. And they're also skeptical, as they should be, of those of us who represent a different kind of power, journalists, as they would be of people who represent governmental power.
You know, it seems to me now maybe perhaps it isn't governmental power that's really the most powerful kind of power, but in a certain way, we look at the networks. You have Disney, GE, and Westinghouse. You know, I was just ran across a few quotes here I thought I'd read and let you comment on. If I can find them here. Dan Rather said, "It took me a long time to understand that a corporation is not a family but a business." And Jennings said that when Cap Cities bought ABC, he felt as if they, meaning ABC, the Cap Cities, were the Nazis, and they, ABC, was occupied France. These are pretty strong. And
I wonder what he would say now about Disney.
Well, the question is, what would he think?
Right.
He might not say it.
Well, I never had any illusions about the fact that we were not a family. We were never a family. I mean, listen, CBS Inc. was a huge corporation. Bill Paley was a shrewd businessman and could be as cold-blooded and ruthless about the bottom line as anybody who owns any of those networks today. I mean, the history is rife with examples of that. He was a brilliant broadcaster and a real visionary about where this business was going. But he was, at the beginning and at the end, a great corporate titan.
But he was a broadcaster.
But he was a lot of other things, too. Remember that. And the Westinghouse people have been broadcasters over the years, but he was a lot of other things. And when push came to shove, he measured broadcasting in one way. You know, they paid a lot of attention to that stock price. We were owned by RCA. You know, we made defense systems, and we owned Hertz and carpet companies at one point, and got kind of into the computer business. And when the news came, and I've said this in front of my GE bosses, when the news came that General Electric was buying NBC, my heart sank. I'm here to tell you, because GE had always been, as I was growing up, the kind of faceless example of American big business run by numbers crunchers and by engineers. And that pretty much proved to be the case for the first few years that we had our relationship. It was a very rocky beginning. And in fairness to GE, they bought NBC when it was number one. It quickly went to number 3 in the primetime ratings. There were a couple of producers at NBC that blew up the pickup trucks of General Motors with sparkers, and not with just the normal chain of events in an accident. And there were people saying that the news division ought to be shut down. And at that point, I had a very candid exchange with Jack Welch, who was the chairman of GE, in which, without going into great detail, we both talked about the kind of public trust that he had as the head of the company that owned this great broadcasting company, and what would be necessary to kind of get it back in line. And if they were going to own it, then they had to decide to do the right things over the long haul about it. And the fact is that now, having GE with its deep pockets and its strategic thinkers, that the National Broadcasting Company, whatever else you may think about its programming or its component parts, is in the strongest position to go into the 21st century. Because we not only have over-the-air television, we have a cable outlet, and we have a financial news outlet, and we have a relationship with Microsoft. And I can tell you that we have never, ever had a telephone call or an underling or someone suggest to us in a lateral way that we ought not to be doing that story because it's not in GE's interest.
Well, NBC did escape. ABC took a hit, and as did CBS, from 2 tobacco companies. When Day One stories had trouble, and 60 Minutes had some trouble. Right. So you guys dodged the bullet there.
And there's some real issues with GE, and our own kind of rule of thumb has been that if GE pops up in the news, that we almost always put it on the air, even when it does not reach the threshold of what would be, we think, newsworthy if we were not owned by GE. If you follow what I'm saying. I mean, we really do try to bend over backwards. And a friend of mine in California raised that with me right away when GE, actually it was somebody in the film business, and it was at Universal, and they'd been bought by a big Japanese company. I was talking to him about the conflict. He said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, well, we're still trying to work that out. And he said, I think you have no choice but to say General Electric, the parent company of NBC News, whenever you do a story about them, so that the audience knows. And we always do then put that parenthetical comment in there.
Have you ever felt, Tom, boy, I'm heading right up to the edge of quitting?
Yeah.
How many times?
Twice. I came very close twice. If I almost quit at the time that we were blowing up the pickup trucks. I mean, I came on the verge. On the other hand, I kind of had seniority there. It was a lifeboat situation for a lot of people who had given their lives to the organization and had performed admirably, and they had no part in all of this. And I thought, if I walk out, and I have the opportunities to do that, it's going to be very tough on these people because it will implode in a way. And I'm not exaggerating my importance to the whole organization, but I did represent some connective tissue, generationally and otherwise. But I came very close. And then we ended up getting a friend of mine, Andy Lack, who'd been at CBS, and I've been trying to get him hired at NBC for some time, and he's been the real godfather of the resurgence of NBC News. The other time goes back much earlier when I was leading the Today Show, and we'd had a man who'd been hired to run the news division who came over from CBS, and he brought in a lot of people actually that I was very fond of from CBS, but it was pretty clear that he was developing a layer of CBS people in the way of those of us who'd been at NBC for a long time. And I was courted, as only he can do that, by Roone Arledge, who was then just beginning to build up ABC, and it was a very heady experience for me. And I came very, very close to going. In fact, one night at dinner with Meredith, I said to her, I think I'm going to go to work for ABC. I went home, and, you know, all my life I'd watched Huntley and Brinkley and gone to work in the organization and had spent my entire adult career there. And it was pretty hard for me to project myself in a whole other news organization at that point because a lot of what we do is based on personal relationships. I land in a place we were talking earlier tonight about Tiananmen Square and being there after the Chinese troops had gone through and the square was closed off, and I had a cameraman who came in from South Africa, kind of a SWAT team from around the world. I got a cameraman in Frankfurt, cameraman in South Africa, producer in Los Angeles, producer in New York, and one in London, and then these technicians who come in primarily from London because we had a big organization there. We'd all converged, and we were there together in Beijing, and we operate kind of like a finely tuned team. And Tony had gone out, and he'd come back with a bicycle the cameraman had. And he got in a bunch of soft drink boxes. And I said, what are you up to? And he said, oh, watch me, mate. And he put the boxes on the back, and then he opened up one of them, and he put in a high-8 camera on its side, lashed the boxes around. We cut a little hole in the boxes. And he said, you get on the bike behind me, and we'll go for a ride through Tiananmen Square. Well, we pulled that off for 3 days before the Chinese finally caught on.
Real high tech, Tom.
And it was, you know, for us, a real moment. But it was, and Tony and I had been through Beirut together, and we subsequently have been through so many other things, Somalia and Desert Storm and everything else. And these are the relationships that are not easy to give up.
You know, Tom, you've had a really incredible and obviously very satisfying life, but what's to be done? I mean, I don't want to sound too Monty Python-ish here and ask the meaning of life question, but I mean, you have a chance to pile it up higher and deeper, or what?
Well, what is it that I'm piling up higher and deeper?
Good deeds.
Let's define that first.
Well, you're doing nightly newscasts. You're doing 15 different things at once. What haven't you done that you feel you need to do with your life?
I need to write a book, and I'm trying to do that. I like to write. I
don't recommend it.
No, I've learned that the hard way as well. I'm not as good as my family members here tonight present will tell you at governing my time.
And I think we have just run haywire through whatever feeble plans you may have had to govern.
I need to take more time to be more reflective and to worry about the things that I really care about, the larger issues. I did do this documentary last year about why we can't live together. I went into a suburb in Chicago and did that, and I would like to be able to do more hours. I have no illusion about how hard it is to get them placed now in a primetime schedule and how much more skillful we have to be to attract the audiences. But all the hours that I've done have been, I'm happy to say, have been popular in terms of ratings. So I'd like to do more of that. I would like to have more opportunity to think. But I think that that's a condition of society. I think that we're all racing around, at an ever faster pace. I like a lot of the new technology. Indeed, I love it. I love cell phones because it makes car trips more productive. You're driving along and, you can call and get business done in the car. I love the new cyber technology for the ease of retrieval and how it works and so on. But at the same time, just like what I was saying about parents earlier or someone who is an overeater, you have to be able to push back from the table and not become hostage to that technology or hostage, frankly, to those invitations and honors that come your way or the opportunities that happen to you when you have these kinds of jobs.
Or even hostage to good ideas, which are...
Hostage to good ideas, and because there are a lot of them out there. And so I'm now at a stage in my life where a number of my friends are beginning to step off the track, so to speak, and they're taunting me from the sidelines a lot.
What are your thoughts about stepping off the track?
Well, I wonder how I would adjust. I'm a pretty active person when I go away now because I love lots of outdoor pursuits, climbing and skiing and fly fishing and doing things. And I have a small group of friends that some people in this audience know about. We call ourselves the Do Boys. It's kind of a loose collection, and we go do something once a year.
No relaxing.
Well, we're finding we're doing things that are a little more relaxing now than we used to. I used to describe it as the Du Bois would take a step and drag Tom, up a glacier at Rainier or something like that. But I think that management of time is very important, and I must confess I'm not as good at it as I'd like to be. And I must say, Orville, my friend, you invited me to come out. It was a great honor to be here as part of the Herb Cain lecture. And you've had me on a short electric-powered leash ever since I arrived yesterday.
I beg forgiveness for this. One other thing I did want to ask you about, I noticed that you told your colleague, and then we'll stop. We'll do some more questions from the audience. You told Tim Russert the following. You said, I love politics, I love politicians, I love the rascals, sometimes more than the others. I wonder, did you ever feel tempted to become one of the rascals?
No. I think in my earliest stage I was very active in student politics, and as long as I can remember, I've loved American politics. And I think that, by the way, that is something I'm more pessimistic about than optimistic about. I think that the state of American politics is in not very good shape right now.
If you compared it to the state of the media, what would the balance be?
Oh, I think that we're probably sharing rough parity at the moment. But politics define who we are. At any given time in history, we are defined by the people that we elect to office and what their policies are and how we are governed and how we want to be governed. So it always befuddles me a little bit when people say, I can't pay no attention to politics. I don't care about politics. It has nothing to do with my life. It has everything to do with who we are. The people that set the tone, that pass the laws, what we're seeing going on in Washington right now with the whole business about campaign finance reform, whether or not it meets any attorney general's definition of needing an independent counsel. We all know this is a shameful episode, not just at the White House, but what's going on the Hill as well. And it's been going on for some time. It's always been the kind of great scandal of American politics, is how much money there is out there and how uneven it makes the playing field, because it does. And there are terrific demands, obviously, on political figures to have money to buy television and radio and so on and so on. But I think it's helped switch off the American public's connection to the public arena, and I think that's too bad. And I think that it is time for us to do something about it. I think some of the proposed laws probably won't stand the test of the courts, and so I'm hoping there will be a kind of a stepping forward on the part of a lot of people to say enough. Because they know in Washington, within the Beltway, how much distance they keep putting between themselves and their constituents, but they seem incapable of breaking the cycle in some way. There's a kind of narcotic about it almost. It does fuel a life in election cycles.
But that befuddles me about why there's not more outrage in the country. Now, we've spent a lot of time on that issue, Orville. That's a very good example of what we need to know. And we've been telling people what they need to know day in and day out and day in and day out, and there's almost no response to it.
You know, I was in a plane the other day, and I found a little clipping I thought I'd read you apropos of the need to know. I mean, what we need to know. This is about your former colleague, Brian Gumbel's new program, Public Eye. This is from, I think it's Entertainment. And here's the way they describe the program. Tough, no-nonsense investigative reporting from the ex-Today Show hosts, plus cooking and beauty tips. I mean, maybe no comment is needed.
I think given his ratings of personality, he wished he'd had more cooking and beauty tips, probably.
Listen, Tom, last question I want to ask you. Since you are here for the journalism school, when you see students, and I must say there are a lot of them still who want to go into journalism, God knows why.
Too many.
Too many.
That's a serious observation.
Too many doctors, too many, I suppose, too many everybody looking at general.
Too many people going into journalism. We've gone, it's kind of feast or famine as it is in a lot of industries, but especially in television, we were always competing, and we thought that we were coming up short for the very best and brightest with, the great newspapers, the Times and the Post and Wall Street Journal and Time and Newsweek and so on. Now, there's been a big shift. We get pretty much anyone that we want to get to come into television because in a generational sense, people have grown up with the medium and care about it, and they've seen life through it and so on. But waves of them keep coming through my door, and we don't have that many jobs, and more of them are attracted to programs, excellent programs like you have here in the graduate school, but every state university and every other public school in America has a huge mass communications department now, cranking these kids out, and there are not enough jobs.
But it's interesting why people keep coming on board. I mean, what is it about this profession that is...
Well, part of it, I mean, it is, listen, I've been, as part of this book that I'm working on, I've been interviewing young women who got into it because I want to make that a chapter. And one of, they've got great role models for them. They've seen Katie Couric and Jane Pauley and Diane, and they've read about their lives, and it seems, as it is, pays well, it's exciting, it's glamorous. It beats teaching school if you go to, a town, mid-sized city in the South, and every day you come in and they say, there's a bank robbery in progress, we want you to go down there and report live on television from the scene of the bank robbery. That beats serious work for a lot of people, and they would like to go down there and do that. So that's part of it.
Mm-hmm. Let's do a couple of quick questions from the floor.
How about some answers from the floor, maybe?
You want to ask some questions? What is the antidote to our culture of celebrity worship?
I don't know. I think we're in. I think it's a real drag on society, celebrity worship. This kind of mindless fascination with anybody who is a public figure. My own guess is that, this is a case where I'm going to probably be dead wrong in 10 years. My own guess is that the death of Diana and the whole paparazzi question and the reaction to it and a lot of what is going on will cause people to kind of rethink about the meaning in their own lives and what it is that fascinates them. Because there was a lot of discussion, if you don't like the paparazzi and you don't like the tabloids and you don't like what happened to her, then you're buying the newspapers when you check out of the grocery stores, or you're buying these magazines and so on. I think as long as you don't have great world crises, as we don't have now, no imminent threat of war of any kind, you have this kind of general level of prosperity going on in this country, no overt threat that a lot of people can identify. We know that there are real problems out there with the environment, with global warming, and with race and so on. But it's not coming up and hitting people in the face every day, so they look for distractions like celebrities, and they try to live out their lives to them. And all that's reinforced in a way by, I think, another very powerful force in American life, and that is the television commercial. Television commercials have helped make a lot of these celebrities. They're so skillfully done. Michael Jordan, who was a transcendent athletic star, but his whole place in our lives was raised in a way by what we saw of him on those commercials. He seemed to be winning to us. And now you see him in the Wheaties commercial or any of them, and that's all reinforced for us. Will the celebrity thing go away? Probably not anytime soon, because there are these great marketing machines out there trying to keep the celebrities in front of people, including NBC. I mean, they promote me, and they promote the other people who are there on a regular basis, and that tends to be self-reinforcing.
What about Richard Jewell? Do you feel comfortable about how that came to pass?
Well, no, it was a very awkward time, obviously, and we did reach an out-of-court arrangement with his lawyers. We all agreed that we wouldn't talk about it. For those of you who are unfamiliar with it, the night that the story broke, we had lots of sources and very high-level law enforcement agencies in Washington who were telling us that Richard Jewell was the primary figure in their investigation and going, in fact, well beyond that. And I went on the air with Bob Costas and said that he still had not been arrested, but this is the man, Richard Jewell, and he was being described by these high-level sources. And he said, well, Bob, and we'd worked this out in advance so that we could be fair to him. He said, well, why would they allow his name to go out if they didn't have the goods on him? And I said, there's speculation, as there was at the time in the law enforcement community, that they had enough on him to arrest him but not to prosecute him. And then I went on to say, but you have to remember, the only way he's being identified now is as a primary figure. In fairness to him, this is all. Well, his lawyers took the one line about that they've got enough to arrest him, but not to prosecute him, and maybe not to convict him at some point, and decided to file a suit in Atlanta. We then had to look at the consequences of that over the long haul and decide whether we want to make an out-of-court arrangement with him. I do think that he was wronged by the FBI. It's indisputable. There was an enormous amount of material that was coming out of only official sources. It wasn't speculation on our part. We had known about him all day long. I first heard of his name at 10 o'clock that morning. We were not going to go on the air with it. Then the Atlanta Constitution went out, and the CNN went on the air with it. Everything that we did, we tried to keep it in absolute context. And the last word I had to say was that, Bob, you must remember that he's only been identified as a major figure in this investigation. That's the extent of it. There have been no charges have been filed against him. So it was one of those, it was a very painful time for me, frankly.
I hate to dredge up all these negative things at the end, Tom, but here's one.
Oh, you love it.
You've been asked many, many times before. NBC has indeed gone softer and more user-friendly. Quote, populist is what NBC executives like to call it, or is it news light? True?
No, I think that there have been moments on the part of all of us, frankly, in which there have been things, well, that was lighter than we'd like to have been. Tonight was almost a perfect example of the kind of mix that you're likely to see on the evening broadcast these days, and to give you kind of an overview of why it is that we're doing what we're doing these days. 30 years ago, there were two broadcasts: Walter Cronkite, Chet Huntley, and David Brinkley. Only two networks, only two places to get the news, and there was kind of news by appointment. People came home every night at 6:30, and they watched either one or the other. They had no other opportunity, or very little opportunity, during the course of that day to find out what had happened in their world that day. And so those broadcasts would go on the air, and they could pretty much just say what they wanted to put on, and people were happy with it, but they didn't have any other choice. Clock moves forward. The time I come on the air at 6:30 at night, or Dan does, or Peter does. By the way, the difference in these programs on any given night are only on the margins, because we keep track of them, all of us, pretty carefully. People have listened to all news radio. They've been on the Internet. They've seen 2 hours of local news before they get to us, or 90 minutes, or an hour minimum, in which they have access to a lot of the same material. And so they have a very good idea of what happened, and so it's not really in our interest or in theirs to be simply a wire service of the air. Therefore, we try to have this kind of mix of stories. Today we had a number of stories that were in the works, because you can never count on the news to provide you with enough material to get through a broadcast on a daily basis that night. We've been working on things all weekend. I'll let you in on something. We have a wonderful piece done on global warming, because the conference opened today and it's going on all week, and we were prepared to put it on tonight. then two things happened. One was that there was an unexpected spy sting in Washington. And I don't know how many of you have been following, the Mossad has really stepped on itself in this attempted assassination of a Hamas leader, and that the two agents were caught, and it's become a great yarn, and now the Sheikh has been returned to the Gaza, and the Netanyahu government really has its back to the wall. And that was a very rich story as well. We also had an exclusive interview with Harold Ickes tonight, and we had the White House tapes from the fundraisers. These are all within the broadcast. Then they had the beginning of an experiment in New York today with a smart card for small purchases, which is going to take us into a whole new era in American life. That's an important consumer story. Then we had promoted over the weekend the phenomenal rise in this country of the use of this herbal potion called St. John Wort, which has gone from zero to millions of dollars in sales, and the FDA is struggling with what they're going to try to do about this herb that is used widely in Europe as an antidepressant, and it's beginning to be used here, but with no guidelines or regulations on it. That's the mix that we had today. Now, I would defy anyone to say, well, that's news light. I mean, all of those stories had real relevance, and that's Monday through Friday, by and large, the kind of mix that you're going to get. But there are, so we set global warming aside today because we'll have another opportunity to put it on tomorrow, and we've already scheduled for tomorrow's broadcast. But we are covering stories that were not covered in the past, and from time to time we will do the story that is news light, and we'll all kind of cringe, but it depends on what else was going on that day in part. If 1989 were happening all over again, Soviet Union were collapsing, Velvet Revolution, Czechoslovakia, Lech Walesa getting elected in Poland, Nelson Mandela being released in South Africa, students in Tiananmen Square, that would be the stuff of the evening broadcast every night. But those kinds of things are not happening in the same way that they were at that time. So we are working harder at doing fewer stories, doing them in greater detail, and finding what I call kind of the new news out there, the stories that didn't get covered in the past, that are important to people, and that they are eager to both want to know about and do need to know about.
Well, Tom, maybe we should leave it here. And thank you so much. It's been most gracious of you to come to Berkeley, and it's been a great pleasure to chat with you.
Thank you all. Thank you all very much.